Hi, I'm Mark Madison, the historian here at the National Conservation Training Center in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. I'd like to welcome you all to another broadcast in our series of Conservationists in Action. Today we're very fortunate to have Jinx Fox join us from the Bureau of Land Management. Jinx Fox is a natural resource specialist who's here to talk specifically about the wild horse and burro program that the BLM manages. So Jinx, welcome to the broadcast. And I'd also like to let those of you in the audience know that we will be taking questions as the program goes on for the next 50 minutes or so. So please feel free to call in with any questions you might have about wild horses or burros, or those of you watching on your PCs, please email in a question because we'd love to make this as interactive as possible. So Jinx, welcome.
Thank you.
And let me just, to kick things off, ask you, in general, what do you do for the wild horse and burro program?
Well, my job is a natural resource specialist right now with the Lower Potomac Field Station, which is the easternmost BLM property in Virginia and in southern Maryland. And each year we hold 1 to 2 wild horse and burro adoptions right there at Meadowood, which is located on Mason Neck just south of Washington, D.C. So we hold adoptions where we bring wild horses and burros to the east and offer them to the public.
Great. And we have a refuge right near you guys. So.
Yeah, if you guys want any.
Our service people should know how to find it. They can pick up the nearest refuge map and go down there.
Right.
And you've brought a slideshow to tell us a little about the program?
Yes, I did. I brought a PowerPoint presentation, and it does have a lot of pictures of wild horses. So I thought what I would do is just run through the program and explain the adoption program, a little bit about wild horses and burros in general and how they got to the United States or North America and how we run our adoption program, and then I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Great.
Okay.
Let's learn the history of.
Okay. Let's go ahead with the PowerPoint, and I'll give you a brief history of the program. Again, I'm with the Bureau of Land Management, and we are in the Department of the Interior with U.S. government. Next slide. How did these wild horses show up in the Americas? That's one of the questions we get asked a lot at our adoptions. And basically, there are very early fossils of Eohippus, which was a fox-sized wild horse. Those can be found in North America. And modern wild horses actually were on the North American continent at one time. However, they had pretty much disappeared by the time the colonial Spanish got here. And the Spanish basically reintroduced the wild horse or modern horse to the Americas. The horses got loose, some of them escaped. There were large ranches in Mexico and New Mexico the Spanish had. Some of them escaped, and the Indians started breeding them, and it kind of went from there. The horses did very well, actually, while they were out there. And by the time the 1800s came along, there were several million wild horses out there. You had horses escaping from ranchers and the cavalry horses. And then during the Depression, a lot of livestock was just let loose when ranchers went under. So by the turn of this century, or the 20th century, we had several million wild horses. And once the automobiles and all that were invented, people started hunting them and were a lot more effective hunting the horses. And the populations decreased to about 6,000 or 7,000 by the 60s. So at that time, a woman named Velma Johnson got involved. And she was very active in getting school children to write to Congress to pass a law to try to protect the horses. And basically the Wild Horse and Burro Free Roaming, or the Free Roaming Wild Horse and Burro Act of 1971 was eventually passed, and that basically designated BLM to manage the wild horses.
Do you know anything about Wild Horse Annie? I mean, what was her real name?
Her real name was Velma Johnson, and she had grown up on a ranch in Nevada, I believe, and was either, I'm not sure if she was a school teacher or a secretary, but she was a very quiet, withdrawn type of woman. But she loved animals and she loved horses. And the story goes that she was once stopped at a parking lot and saw a truck with, this is kind of gruesome, blood dripping from it. And she went to investigate, and there were actually some wild horses that had been captured there that were pretty well cut up and everything, and they were going to the meat market. So at that point, she really knew she had to do something, and she got this campaign started with the school kids, and I think at the time Congress received more correspondence than for any other issue.
It's a great
ever.
story how one
So,
person can make a difference. Oftentimes
yeah.
you think, well, what could I do for conservation?
Absolutely.
And Wild Horse Annie made
yes,
a huge
and
difference.
a shy type of person.
Yeah,
so.
school teacher. That's
So the act was passed again in 1971. It's the Wild Free Roaming Horses and Burro Act. I tend to get it kind of confused. And it designated the horses as being protected and designated BLM to manage the populations.
Okay.
And what we've done, there are several different herd management areas in the West, and the populations have to be managed at certain levels. And so once the population increases in a particular herd management area, then BLM goes in and does gathers to bring the population back down.
And these herd management areas are on BLM and Forest Service lands, or just BLM lands?
Mostly BLM lands.
BLM
I mean,
lands,
the BLM ones are obviously on BLM lands. There are
Okay.
wild horses on Forest Service lands, and we help them out too.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think it's under 200.
So the
Wow.
majority are on BLM lands.
Right,
basically.
and they are designated, to have certain populations of wild horses. And wild horses really should not be in other lands outside of the herd management areas. So when we get to an area or a situation where the population is growing too large, we do roundups and gathers to kind of bring them back down to where it needs to be. And we have our adoption program, which is the main means we have for placing excess animals on public lands.
Is there a place where they go between the roundups and adoption?
Yeah, we have holding facilities. When we do a roundup or a gather, we've got holding facilities, and we actually will hold horses. We give them all their blood work, their vaccinations, their Coggins tests, and everything before they come into the adoption program.
Would you do that where you work in Mason Neck area, or?
No, what we would do at Mason Neck is just bring the animals that have already been through our holding facilities
Okay.
to the east and hold an adoption event, say, over a weekend. And then the animals that aren't adopted get shipped to another adoption.
That's very interesting.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun. Wild horses come in all colors. Typically, most of them are going to be your bays and chestnuts. We also have pintos. I think we see up here on the screen a Grillo.
What is that?
If you look closely, he's kind of a dun type color, and he probably has a dorsal stripe. And I noticed he's got some faint zebra stripes on his legs. That's a pretty rare color. But most of your wild horses are going to be your bays and your chestnuts, because
Do we know why?
it's just the dominant color pattern. It's just like with domestic horses. If you look out in a normal field, you're going to see a lot of bays and chestnuts. But they come in all colors, etc. The burros are mainly in the southwestern states, which would be Arizona, Southern California, and Southern Nevada. And burros pretty much descended from stock that the colonial Spanish brought in. You've seen, the pictures of the monks or the friars with the burros. And then they were used a lot in the mining industry too, in the early mining industry with prospectors, where you see the old prospector and he's got the burro carrying his pack and everything.
Now, is a burro a species native to Europe, actually, that wasn't found
I
in
believe
North America?
Yeah. And actually, now they're extended down in Africa. There's all kinds of species in Africa also. But a burro is basically like a domestic donkey, and they're a lot of fun. We don't have as large a population of burros, but there are plenty out there still. And if you're ever in Arizona, you might see some as you're driving along. Yeah. Let's see the next slide. Okay. Again, all colors. In the adoption program, people really want to see the paints and the pintos. That's what they like to see.
Those are the most popular.
Yes, yeah. And the next slide. And again, another burro. Most of the burros are going to be your light grays. This one's a darker one. Sometimes we get some that are almost dark black, and they're very interesting. And you can see the stripe, the dorsal stripe going down, then they have the stripe coming down the shoulders,
Yeah.
which is kind of pretty. Okay, and this shows you what the typical range looks like with wild horses. Again, they're out in pretty sparse country. It's mostly sage country. A lot of horses in Nevada. That's the state that has the largest population. And but they're also in the 10 other western states. And that's where we are involved in managing them. And once we get into our capture, We do use helicopters to bring horses from some of the more remote areas and just kind of push them into a central location where we set up corral panels. And we also can use outside riders at some time too. Next slide. What we do, we'll set up large T-posts and sometimes jute fencing, something like that, and you create a big V shape where you're bringing the horses down into a funnel, and then you'll have your heavy-duty corral panels at the end of the funnel. Next slide. And you can kind of see the horses coming in here towards the capture site itself. The corral panels that they're heading into are going to be 6-foot high, heavy-duty metal pipe corrals.
Now, do you select particular horses to round up, or do you just round up a certain number?
Well, pretty much when you round them up, you get what you catch.
Okay.
Yeah, and sometimes at the roundup site, some of the horses will be let back out, and then the other ones will come into the adoption program.
How would you make that distinction?
A lot would depend on why the roundup occurred. Was it to manage the population? You know, in that case, we may take only so many horses off the range and then put the rest of them back out. Or it may be if it was a fire situation or a drought situation where there's nothing for them to eat, then we'll go ahead and bring them all in.
Oh.
Yeah. Next slide. Give you a little bit of an idea. The total number of horses that we've adopted since 1972, over 160,000. There are fewer burros out there, so we've adopted over 32,000 burros. And I think we've got the burro population pretty much under control now. But the horses, we still have many more horses than we should have out there on the rangelands right now. And we have to manage them, you know, in comparison also with wildlife issues and the wildlife use of the range, and then cattle grazing and things like that. Some of the requirements to adopt, sorry, this is another slide. It just shows for 03, another slide showing just the number of horses we removed in 03, which was quite a few, and basically the adoption program is running at about half of the horses that are coming off the range.
I mean, that's kind of a striking statistic there, in
Yeah.
that the burros, it looks like they all got adopted. But the horses, there's the ones that aren't adopted, where are they staying?
Well, the ones that were not adopted, generally the older horses were going out on long-term sanctuaries, or there were ranches that we had contracted out to hold the older horses. There has been a recent amendment to the act that directs BLM to sell horses that are over 10 or that have been to 3 adoptions and haven't been adopted yet. And some of those older horses might go there.
Let's look at the more pleasant aspect of it. Tell me a little about the sanctuaries. What is a horse sanctuary?
Well, I shouldn't be using the word sanctuary, actually, because that's one word we try to stay away
retirement
from.
home.
Basically, there's some ranches where we have entered into contracts for long-term holding, and the horses turned out on the ranches. Some of them are in Oklahoma, which has much better grass, obviously, than some of the rangelands, say in northern Nevada, that they come off of. So
and
that's
you just
pretty
pay
much
a little rent to have.
Yeah, you pay per head.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and it's a good deal for the rancher, and has been up to now. You know, a good deal for the horses.
Yeah, well, that's great.
Some of the let me get into some of the requirements to adopt. Again, and because the adoption is our main avenue for placing these animals, we really put a lot of emphasis on this program. Adopters must be at least 18 years old. If a child wants a horse, the parent needs to adopt the horse. They must have no convictions for inhumane treatment of animals. And also, they have to be financially able to provide for their adopted animal. That does not mean we ask them what their salary is, but we will do follow-up compliance inspections on a number of horses to make sure they're taken care of humanely.
Can I ask, how do you check for convictions of
animal abuse?
Yeah. I mean, is there like a place you can go and just enter a name and
Yes, well, that's a possibility, yeah, but we pretty much have to take people's word, because the number of adopters we deal with is so large. But if we do become aware that an adopter has a past conviction, we will go back and repossess the animals. Getting into some of the requirements for adopting, the adopter must have a corral that's at least 400 square feet, which isn't all that large. That's 20 by 20. And I usually recommend about twice that size per animal. But the minimum requirement is 400 square feet on your corral. The fencing has to be at least 6 feet high for adult horses and 5 feet high for horses that are less than 18 months or burros. And that is because the horses are still completely wild when somebody takes their horse home. And if the fence is not that high, the horse is going to go somewhere else, basically. The corral must be constructed of pipe, which tends to be the easiest to use, the pipe corral panels, or it could be a wood board, but under no circumstances should it be barbed wire or electric tape or electric wire or anything like that, because these horses are not used to that type of thing. And we do have an application to adopt, and basically it's a 2-page form. It's general information asking the adopter to show out, to describe their facilities, describe what they're going to feed the horse and how they're going to water it, so that we know they at least have a clue of how to take care of the animals. And we also ask for a map and a sketch of the facility. And this is very useful when we're doing compliance inspections, because again, we get out to maybe about half of the horses adopted, and we do follow-ups. And we also work with some of the Department of Agriculture vets, and they've been very helpful in helping with doing compliance inspections for us or investigating an inhumane treatment complaint. Okay, next question. We also have a questionnaire just kind of getting into if somebody has a farrier, things like that. Do you have a regular blacksmith, etc. Now, what you see at an adoption event, and this one, it looks like it could be somewhere in the Midwest. I'm not really sure, but this is what it'll look like at Lorton where I work. We'll actually go in there. We set up temporary corral panels like this in different corrals with a central aisleway, and we'll segregate the horses. We'll have yearlings in one corral, studs in another, burros in another, mares in another. So that's a scene at a typical adoption. Next slide. And these are some of the horses, very typical of what's coming off the range. Again, a lot of chestnuts and the bays with the black socks, and a couple horses with color. And depending on what part of the country you're in, some areas they really want the color. We can always adopt out the paints and the Appaloosas, but some of the darker colors, it's harder to do. Sure. It really is. Yeah. And the next slide, here, these are some burros, and this shows pretty well on the lead burro. You can see there's a freeze brand on the left side of his neck. Every time we take an animal and we take it off the range into the adoption program, they are freeze branded. And the freeze brand starts with what looks like a giant U, and then it's got a series of symbols that relate to a number. So we can actually look up in the computer when that burro there was captured, where he was captured, when he was adopted, who adopted him, et cetera, et cetera. So,
what is a freeze brand for folks that might not be familiar with that terminology?
Okay, well, it's a brand, and it's super cooled, and basically it causes the hair follicles to grow in white after you brand the horse. You would clip the horse or the burro, clip his neck, and kind of clean it off with some rubbing alcohol, and then this thing is super cooled, and basically you just hold it against their neck for 10 seconds, and it causes the hair follicles to grow in white. And it's a lot more humane than the old hot brands, obviously.
Yeah. Well, I'd never heard of that
They
before.
don't jump around, they don't, except for they're not used to having people next to them, but it doesn't hurt.
And then why do you want to be able to track them? Why is that important?
That's important because when a horse or a burro goes into the adoption program and is adopted by somebody, they're still under federal protection. As soon as somebody adopts, they do not automatically own that animal, and the animal is protected. After the adopter has the horse or burro for a year, they can apply for the title, and once they get the title, they can then sell the animal. But this protects them until they're titled.
I see.
Yeah. Okay, next slide. We do have some pictures of a couple successful and crazy adopters. This is a fellow named Walt Gentry, and he lives out in Illinois, and one of his adopted horses. And we were just talking about this before the show. He actually is a Civil War reenactor, and he uses several Mustangs. And he has a bay Mustang that he was riding in the movie Gods and Generals.
That's great.
And a bunch of these Civil
Filmed
War
right around
reenactors.
here.
Yeah, it was filmed right up the road from here.
BLM
yeah.
helping out our movie industry. We
Yeah.
appreciate that.
Yeah,
and the
I
West
don't know.
Virginia local tourism industry.
So look for a bay horse with a freeze brand. I think they probably covered the freeze brand.
Now,
But
why do you think somebody who's a Civil War reenactor would want to use a wild horse? Why wouldn't he just go to a horse farm and
Walt and his wife, Melody, are real enthusiasts of the whole program. And basically, they just were so impressed by the first couple of Mustangs they adopted that they have become total Mustang advocates. And it's a hardy animal. They're very, they're very handy. They don't tend to trip or anything like that. So then versatile and tough. And it's real typical of the type of horse, say, that might have been ridden back in that era, too.
So that's a great benefit we don't normally think of associated with the adoption program.
Yeah, absolutely. And some of the wild horse herds are descended from cavalry horses that were let loose.
Which is very interesting.
Something to think about. Yeah, we have a couple other pictures showing something not to do. We don't recommend you do this on your horse right away. We have a couple girls that ride their horses doing trick rides and things like that with their Mustangs. And this one came through a little clearly, but they're pretty fearless. But again, you can see these animals, they can certainly be trained to do just about anything.
Yeah.
They're very trainable and very versatile animals.
And that's where the sure-footedness would be very handy if your head is 6 inches off the ground.
Yeah. We do have the U.S. Army Caisson platoon has adopted some wild horses. This is Casparina. She is a cremello, which is not a typical color to see in the Caisson platoon. All their other horses are blacks or grays. But Casparina has been there, it must be 15 years now. And they do the ceremonial burials at Arlington Cemetery. And there's another wild horse, Lonesome, who's been adopted by the U.S. Army Caisson platoon. And he is a dark horse and very handsome horse. He was actually adopted by a BLMer who then donated him, I think, to the Caisson platoon. So that gives you some idea of how they can turn out. We've got some pictures of some other adopters. This is a woman in Pennsylvania right up the road from here, and her adopted horse, Nevada, and that was actually taken at one of our Lorton, Virginia adoptions where I work. And this horse, a nice big drafty cross, and he actually comes out of the state of Nevada. And it's really interesting because different herds have very different characteristics. And Nevada tends to have a lot of horses that have quarter horse in them. Mm-hmm. Some of the herds actually have draft horse in them. They tend to be nice, big, solid animals. And then you get up into California and there might be some herds with thoroughbred in them.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so it's a lot of fun. Okay, well, how can you help the Wild Horse and Burro adoption program? Obviously by adopting a wild horse and burro, but a lot of the help we rely on is just educating people about the program and the potential of what these horses can do. So helping us educate, passing on information. Also, I rely quite a bit on volunteers at our adoption, both getting the word out, putting flyers out, as well as helping at the actual adoption event. And we do have compliance. We do some training for volunteers to help with compliance. We usually rely on like animal control specialists or some of the APHIS, Department of Agriculture, animal care people. They help us a lot with the compliance. And just getting the word out to different groups and talking with your congressman and promoting the program. These are things that anybody can do, even if they can't take home a wild horse and burro at this point in time.
Like me.
Yeah. So that's pretty much it in a nutshell. It's a very broad perspective of the adoption program and the horses.
Well, Jinx, thank you. That was a great overview of the program, and it raised a lot of questions. Okay. And I'd like to encourage folks, if you do have a question, please do call in, use the 1-800 number, or call in on, or send us an email, because I'm sure Jinx will be happy to answer a bunch of questions. But I'm going to take advantage of being right here with you and ask you a quick question that some people are probably thinking of, and that's, do you have any horses?
Do I have any horses?
Yeah.
Yes. I've got, I think, 11 right now, and that includes one Mustang, or wild horse, and one burro. My burro is from Arizona. His name is Jerome, and he was 12 when we got him. And he's an old cranky burro, but he's a lot of fun. He wakes us up at 3 o'clock in the morning, braying. And then my little Mustang is from Utah.
And let me ask you this, especially since you have a Mustang. First of all, is Mustang a technical term or just a term we use for any wild horse? Because I honestly don't know.
It's kind of interesting. A wild horse is really the correct term.
Okay.
The term Mustang has been used. It's used a lot by our Eastern adopters to denote a wild horse from the West. If I say wild horse to an Eastern adopter, they may think it may be a Chincoteague pony I'm talking about.
I see.
So, but if I say a Mustang, then they know we're talking about wild horses from the West. So basically, it's used synonymously.
So Ford Motor Company ought to be underwriting.
We wish.
This program is part of the
It would be nice,
Mustang.
absolutely.
But let me ask you, you get a Mustang and you take it home. What do you have to do to be able to ride the thing or have it? I mean, what's the first step?
Well, the first step is getting him out of the trailer. At the adoption, we we will load the wild horse or the burro into somebody's trailer, and they have to be stock type trailers with a swing gate. We don't use a ramp trailer, because if you're running a horse through a chute onto a trailer, the first thing he's going to do is turn around and head back. You don't want to be down there pushing a ramp. You just want to be able to slam the door. So we load up the animal at the adoption. When the adopter gets the animal home, we tell them you need to back up to your corral and make sure your corral fence is securely fastened or next to the side of the trailer before you open that trailer. They can't just take the animal out and lead it into a stall. You open the trailer, and usually they'll pop right out into the corral. And the best thing to do really is to wait several days, give the animal time to settle down, and just be around it but be quiet. And it's really interesting. The older horses are tough. Some of them take a long, long time. But the young horses and the burros tend to gentle up really well.
Really?
Yeah, and they come right along. And the most important thing is spending time. I try to tell adopters, don't adopt a wild horse unless you can spend at least an hour a day with that horse, even if it's just sitting in the corral reading a book while the horse gets comfortable with your presence. Yeah.
Do you ever have people adopt a horse and then call you up and say, "Oh, I made a mistake. Can you take it back?" Or does that never happen?
It does happen on occasion. We have a good network of other adopters that help mentor, and there's usually, no matter where somebody lives, there's usually somebody in that area who's been through the process who's willing to help them out. But we do on occasion have to take animals back, and what we will try to do is reassign them to another adopter. Say the original adopter may have died or gotten sick too. That does happen, especially when you're dealing with the numbers we are.
And do you have some type of profiles of your adopters? For example, are a lot of people adopting because their child would like a horse, or because, they always want a horse?
It's all types. It used to be it was more rural and farm type people, and now we're getting a lot of the, baby boomers getting into this as everything else.
Farmettes that
yeah.
they want a critter on it.
The kids are out of the house, so let's try a wild horse. So the market has changed, I think, quite a bit in the last 10 years. It really has. One interesting thing, too, is that with the burros, they're used a lot for predator control. We were talking about coyotes earlier before the show, and coyotes are a problem here in the East now. And burros are very good at going after wild dogs or coyotes and running them away from the sheep. You just need to make sure you get them bonded to the sheep first,
and how
or
do
the
you do
cattle.
That? So burros will get along okay in a pen with sheep.
Yeah,
basically.
yeah. If it's a young one, it should bond fairly quickly. If you get an older burro, you're going to have to introduce it to the sheep slowly. You don't want to just put it in with the sheep because he may kick a few and go after them. So you want to kind of go through a slow process.
Do burros make better pets for kids than wild horses?
Not necessarily, though. I do have one adopter in Virginia who's adopted a bunch of burros, and her kids trail ride them because the burros are very sure-footed, and if they're unsure of anything, they just stop. They don't take off like a horse does necessarily. So she's got a bunch that her children trail ride, and then she actually drives them with a cart.
Well, that's interesting.
And takes them around and promotes them and does that. So.
Because I think the wild horse aspect of adoption is probably better known to the public than the burro part. I don't think people often think that there's a wild burro issue out there.
Yeah, and actually we had surplus burros for quite a while, and now we're starting to get low on burros. So
supply and demand.
It's supply and demand, yeah. I'm hoping, we do have an adoption coming up at Lorton where I work the first weekend in June, and I am hoping we can get some burros, but I'm not sure right now.
Oh, that's
but
great.
We should have plenty of young horses that'll gentle up very easily.
Well, that's... let me ask you this. Earlier you showed us the Freeze brand, and one of the questions that occurs is why do we put the brand on the neck opposed, in the old westerns it went on the rump.
Well, the Western brand too was a big brand.
Yes.
So this is a long series of numbers basically. They're a little angle code, but it all relates to numbers, and it'll have a big U and then a series of symbols. So it's kind of a long stretched out brand, and that's why they decided to stick it on the neck.
It wouldn't fit as well.
Well,
We'd have to run halfway up the...
It might be hard to read too.
With a saddle on or something on the horse.
Yeah.
Earlier in your discussion, you talked very briefly about herd management areas, and what goes into making a decision about how many horses can be supported in an area? Are you looking at water, grass, acreage? Honestly, I don't
yes,
know.
Yes.
Are any of these
it's
preeminent
everything.
as a limiting factor, or?
Well, we have to look at what the range can support, number one, and that's not just the horses, but the cattle, the wildlife out there, because you don't want to be degrading the range itself. And the other critical issue, especially in the arid West, is the water issue. So we look at all of those, but the populations are also set by what the populations were when the law was passed in '71. So each herd management area will have a designated population limit over which, once the population gets up above it, that's when we go in and do a gather. We are doing some really interesting work with the Department of Agriculture on immunocontraceptive vaccines, where they're hoping to get a vaccine where they would basically capture a bunch of wild horses and vaccinate all the mares, and that would hopefully keep them from having foals for several years.
They just give them a shot of a horse, Depo-Provera or something?
Something like that.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So that shows a lot of promise, and I think that would be a good way to help manage the populations.
It sounds very interesting.
Yeah.
Speaking of herds, how are the horses organized in the wild? I mean, most of the horses we see here in West Virginia are on somebody's farm and so on. But what are the family groups, or what do we mean when we talk about
a herd of wild horses?
Yeah.
It kind of varies depending on where you are. Some of the herds, it'll be a group of horses. There's generally, it's one stud who's kind of the boss, and there might be some young horses in there that are male, but no older male horses. And then there's a lead mare, and she kind of does most of the decision making. And then the other mares follow her example. And the stud's there to protect them and fight with the other studs and drive away the colts once they get to be about 2 or 3.
So how big a group are they? Are they like?
It varies tremendously. In some parts of the West, it may only be 3 or 4 together. Other parts, you may have quite a few. I mean, nothing more, I wouldn't think, than 10 or 15.
And are they territorial? I mean, will you find them in a certain area?
Yeah, they have certain territories where each herd will roam around. Yeah. And in some parts of the West, they go in a certain area in the winter, and then they'll go up higher in the summertime too. So. And the herds, the massive numbers of adoptions and so on you've done, why are their numbers increasing so quickly out west? I mean, it seems like they're, Well, they have they reproduce about 20% a year, so they're very successful at reproducing. So we've got a 20% reproduction rate, which I believe, if you know statistics, every 4 years the population could double. It's something like that. I'm not into statistics at all. So we have a high reproduction rate, very successful, and there are also very few natural predators left. Very few areas where they're natural predators, except for maybe parts of California. I think there's cougars that keep the populations of certain herds, so we don't even have to do gathers.
Really?
But man has pretty much eliminated most of the natural predators in the West, and that's why the population just keeps growing and growing. So
nobody's ever suggested reintroducing cougars to Nevada, probably.
Well, there's probably some there too. Mountain lions, things like that.
Well, let's move back to the adoption for a second, because one thing that occurred to me is you've done these adoptions and for quite a while and seen a lot of folks come through. If you had to give some suggestions for an adopter to think about, what would they be before they pursue this? Before
they decided to adopt, or
how about both? Before they decide to adopt, and then after they adopt, and what would be the good first steps? You suggested a few, but you probably have a lot of advice.
Yeah, I think before they decide to adopt, I think they need to take a good hard look at how much time they have to spend the animal. Don't do it unless you have the time to spend to gentle the animal. That's going to be critical. You also need to make sure you've got the right facility, and that's why we do have very specific facility requirements on adopting. Because the worst thing is if somebody turns a horse out on a 5-acre field, I mean, they would never get their hands on it. It's got to be in that corral till he's gentled.
I see.
Yeah, we always, we try to help adopters if they come to us at an adoption and say, what do you think of this horse? What do you think of that horse? I generally tell people, don't pick the horse that's the most aggressive one, and you don't want the one that's the most submissive. Try to get one that's kind of in between and that doesn't jump to the other side of the corral if you walk up next to the fence. You want one that's going to react fairly quietly and gently and all that. When they get the horse home, the critical thing is spending the time and not pushing it. Baby steps are best. You know, just try little increments and work slowly with the horse. It's better to go slowly than go too fast and make a mistake and have to go back to square one.
And what are horses looking for? I mean, you know, we talked about the people. I mean, but what do they make of it when you're sitting outside the corral, reading a magazine or something? I mean,
well, you
do
want
they think
them
they're
to
reestablishing
bond.
a herd or something, or what's going on?
I don't know if they're thinking that, but
Yeah, I realize you're not telepathic, but
not yet. But they are herd animals, and you know, in the wild they were with a specific herd, and then they were captured and put in with a lot of horses and run through the system. Once they get to the adopter's home, they're all alone. It's probably the first time they've ever been away from other horses in their life, and not
That's
next to other horses, unless they're, you know, being freeze branded in a chute.
Right.
So one thing you really want to do is try to get them to bond with you. Once they do, and once they know that you're not going to hurt them or put them in a situation where they could get hurt, you're 99% there. That's what you're looking for. And a lot of the horses will become one-person horses.
Well, that's interesting.
It's a really strong link. Yeah.
So the first person to bond with them, and then do they see that person as like the lead horse, like the stud horse? You said just a
lead mare.
Lead mare.
Yeah.
I forgot that was the one that was in charge. It's like human society.
She's the boss. Yeah, she's the boss.
You said you recommend people don't pick the most aggressive horse. That makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
But then you said also, you know,
don't
beware
want
the most submissive.
timid.
What's the
Well, that
problem
that horse may always be scared of everything, and he may be very hard to gentle just because he's super scared of everything and used to being at the bottom of the pecking order.
I see.
Yeah.
So it's like a cowed horse, basically.
Yeah. I mean, or he may be super high strung, which is more of a challenge to an adopter.
Very much so.
Yeah.
Now, do the horses go through medical examination before they're adopted?
Yeah, when we capture the horses and we bring them into the corrals or into our holding facility, they all get blood tested. They have their Coggins test done, which is a test that you have to do. They get a series of shots, everything from the regular shots the horses get, tetanus, all of that, to, we were for a while, I think we're still doing rabies in some areas, West Nile virus, things like that. So before they even get shipped to an adoption, they will have their blood work done. They'll have their shots up to date, and they are wormed on a regular basis while they're held in captivity.
Something else you mentioned earlier is for the first year, it's kind of a probationary period, right? For the person that adopts a horse, what do they have to do in that first year before they can get title to the horse? Are there certain
Well, they have to
things
care for the animal humanely. And in order to do that, they've got to make sure that, you know, they keep the weight on the horse, they feed it right, and they've also got to keep the feet trimmed. Now, in order to trim the feet, they're going to have to gentle the horse, otherwise you can't trim the feet. So they need to, you know, they need to work with the animal, get it gentled. It's critical to start working with it fairly soon after you bring it home, too, so it doesn't get used to being wild in that location. So it's basically they have to take care of the animal, and they don't have to get it to a certain level as far as saddle breaking or anything like that.
They don't have to be riding it.
No,
For a year.
no. And you know, a lot's going to vary depending upon the animal and how quickly it adapts and everything.
You've been using the phrase gentle the horse a lot. For those of us who don't have horses, how would you know you've gentled a horse? I mean, are there some characteristics of a horse, maybe besides being able to trim it?
Yeah. Well, I think if you could walk up to a horse, and to a wild horse, and put your hand on its neck, put a halter on it, lead it around, have it not be nervous next to you, you pretty much gentled that horse. That's where you want to be.
And do some of these horses become, or do a fair number of them become like working horses? Do they actually go to fairs or whatever? Here in the East,
we have wild horses being fox hunted, used for dressage, jumping, eventing. So they're working. Out west, obviously the ranches. I know that some wild horses are used as pack animals out west with strings of, you know, people that go out hunting and take hunters out. And then we have the horses that the Quezon Platoon has adopted. They're at Arlington Cemetery. And just last spring, the U.S. Park Police adopted a Mustang, and he's working downtown D.C. now.
Well, that's a good
He's
idea.
on the streets.
Help
Absolutely.
out another interior agency and adopt a horse.
And that horse came from a prison gentling program in Colorado at Canyon City.
Now, what's that?
Oh, okay. This is, there's several out there where prisoners work and gentle wild horses. And it's a real win-win situation for both the wild horse because they're getting gentled.
Right.
Therefore, they have a better chance of finding a good adopter. And it's teaching the prisoners skills. So it's a real win-win program. The one that Star came out of is in Canyon City, Colorado, and it's also a holding facility for BLM there. So sometimes they have up to 500 head right there.
Wow.
Yeah.
Does it gentle the prisoners too?
One hopes so.
Hopefully.
Apparently they have a lower rate of coming back after they get out, so that's a good thing.
That's good. What about your, geographically, your adopters? Are there some parts of the country that adopt a lot more horses than other parts?
Yeah. I work for BLM Eastern States, and basically Eastern States covers the 31 states east of and adjacent to the Mississippi River. And the East is the largest adopter market for BLM, mainly because that's where most of the U.S. population is. And it's also a lot cheaper to keep a horse here. Maybe not cheaper, but you can keep a horse on less land here without having to feed it a lot because we have so much more rain. So the East is pretty much where the largest adopter market is. And then after that, I would say California.
And where are most of the wild horses found?
Most of the horses, the largest populations are actually in Nevada. They have the largest number, and then the 10 other western states, everywhere from Montana, Wyoming, down to California and Arizona, Utah.
And I don't remember if you told us earlier, but about how many horses are there in the wild? Just a rough.
Okay, a rough guess. I know about 5 years ago there were about 50,000. I'm thinking there's still over 30,000 now, and we need to get down to around 25, 27,000 is where the management level we should be at is.
So you're looking for 3,000 to 4,000 more adopted horses.
Oh, at least.
How do you?
They're still reproducing.
Yeah, I guess.
this summer.
I mean, if you say you got down to your management number, do you
Right.
have an estimate of how many you would need to adopt every year after that?
I
roughly?
don't know that figure off the top of my head. I really don't. I would think it would be about, and I'm guessing, 4,000, ballpark maybe.
So
Yeah.
it's going to be an ongoing program for
Yes.
a long time to come.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think it'll be here for a long, long time. Yeah. And our adopters, it's really fun. It's a fun program because the adopters really love the animals and they support the whole program. And they bring their adopted gentled horses to our adoptions to show people what can be done.
How do you publicize the program? I mean, how do you let folks know about the adoption program? Is it primarily word of mouth or?
It's a little bit of
through
everything.
media?
Yeah. It's a little bit of everything. We have, we do a lot of advertising right before an actual adoption event, and do radio and TV interviews, things like that. So it's a little bit of everything. Word of mouth. We send flyers out to feed and tack stores. Actually, when I was coming over here this morning, I stopped at Southern States and I left some flyers there.
Oh, good.
So, doing my part.
So you guys are working quite a bit. It looks like one of the people that's been watching us on their PC actually has a question. And we have a question here. Jinx, with limited resources on any given range, which animal do you think is the best survivor? Perhaps watching too much TV. Horse, burro, buffalo, elk, antelope, or deer?
Wow. I don't know how to answer that one. Who is the best survivor? I know horses and burros. I do not know that much about elk and antelope. So
What about
sorry.
between horses and burros?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Is one
I
of
can't
them
answer that.
adapted for different environments?
Well, the burros do well in the Southwest, the warmer states. You don't find them up in the northern extremes. So if it's an area with, say, a lot of snow and stuff like that, you would find horses would do better than burros. But I really don't know how they would, compete with antelope and deer and some of the other species.
They usually don't these days.
Yeah.
Well, that brings up a good question, though. Your wild horse management areas, are there a lot of other herbivores and so on in those same areas, or is it primarily?
Yeah.
Do they interact with antelope and
Yeah, there are antelope
elk?
and other things like that, depending on what part of the country it's in. Yeah.
And does that
definitely.
affect the ability to support the?
Yeah, well, I mean, it'll all depend on how many elk are out there and how many antelopes and horses. Yeah, so the number of the wildlife versus the number of horses versus the number of cattle out there, it's all got to be kind of meshed into the equation of what the range can support. And really
And
what
who
we're looking
determines
at.
all this? Do
We
you
have
have
a-
like scientists doing
Yeah, we
quadrant studies or
range conservation specialists are out there. They monitor the range conditions, and we work with a lot of the state agencies too, the state wildlife agencies, et cetera. And then again, in each of the herd management areas, the population of horses has to be kept at a certain level and is capped. Now, one time we do gathers and bring them down way below the level is sometimes if we have a fire situation or extreme drought. We've had to go out and do emergency gathers and just bring all the wild horses off of some areas when the springs dry up. Because some of the areas the horses are in, they may go 20 miles just to get a drink of water.
Really?
And then they've got to cover a lot of ground to get the forage because it's pretty dry.
After a fire, would you then move them to another management area or just try to get them adopted?
They would probably go into the adoption program unless they were held specifically to go back to the range they came from. But in general, they would not be turned out in another area.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
I'll ask you another question because it comes up a lot in Fish and Wildlife Service, and that
Sure.
the public has all sorts of ideas about some of the animals we work with, wolves or bald eagles. We hear quite a bit of that, and I wonder what perceptions folks have about wild horses. It's something they probably don't come into contact with a lot, but do you hear people have preconceived notions about wild horses or what they're going to be like?
Yeah, very much so. I think, the old attitude, especially in the West, was that they were kind of vermin or just, a nuisance species. And there's still some people out there that would rather not see wild horses out there. Here in the East, we get all kinds of attitudes from people that don't even know they exist to people that have totally glamorized or something what they are. So there's a lot of different perceptions out there. One problem we've dealt with a lot, and I think we've taken care of it, is a lot of horse people thought they were basically untrainable for a long time. And now that we have so many adopters taking wild horses out and showing them and competing them and taking them to our adoptions, people see that they can be gentled and what they can really become great animals.
So you've erased some of those stereotypes.
I think so, yeah. And again, it's a matter of continuing to educate people and get the word out about the program.
And if we're talking about perceptions, when you have one of these adoptions, you showed us a slide before of an adoption site, maybe in the Midwest.
Yeah.
Do some of the horses not get adopted and then be put out to pasture, or do usually all of them get adopted?
A lot depends. We hope to adopt every horse when we have an adoption. That's always the hope, but usually there will be some horses that are not adopted, and they go back to a holding facility and then they get shipped to another adoption site. So we continue to try adopting them as much as we can.
Do you line up the number of applicants with horses?
Like-
say I fill out my piece of paperwork, an application,
Okay.
and I lie and say I have a big corral, and all of a sudden, none of which I have because I live in the city.
And it happens.
But pretend I'm a real applicant,
Okay.
and there's 150 people like me
Right.
in a region, like near Mason Neck. Then would you bring out 150 horses, or would you take 200 horses?
If I had 150 applications going into an adoption, I'd bring 300.
You bring 300. Why would you bring twice as many?
Because a lot of people don't send in their applications ahead of time. They will actually apply there at the adoption.
I didn't know you could do that at the adoption.
Yes, yeah, you can apply at the adoption. We do encourage people to apply ahead of time.
Okay.
That way I can go through the application and say, no, you need to change this in your corral, and they have time to do it before the event.
Okay.
But people can apply at the adoption. Basically, here in the East, our adoptions are usually over a weekend. And what we do is we'll bring the animals in, say, early Friday morning and let them rest Friday morning and then be open to the public just to come in and look at the animals Friday afternoon.
Okay.
And then the adoption itself starts on Saturday morning, and we do it by competitive bid. And basically, everybody has to have their application approved before we do the bidding in the morning. And then we'll run all the animals through the competitive bid process. And most of them will not get bid on. But if there's a paint filly that 3 people want, she's going to get bid on. The minimum adoption fee at the adoptions is $125. And after the bid, then all the other horses that remain are still available at $125.
Okay.
And that's when most of them will get adopted. Usually at the bid process, people are going for the nicest animals there. And some of them may get priced out of their price range.
How high do the bids go?
They can go way up there. Last October at Lorton, Virginia, we had a little Appaloosa colt, and he was great. He was beautiful. A little tank. He went for 1900.
Wow.
There were two women, and they were both going to get him, and he was well worth it. I've talked to his adopter, and he's a real sweetheart, very quiet and laid back. So he's going to be a nice horse. But the average adoption fee is still under $200.
And do these funds go back to support the wild horse program?
Yeah,
or
they
into
go
a
in
general
to help
fund?
us with the transportation, because we do have to haul them from the west to the east.
Sure, yeah. $200 is a bargain
Yeah.
for a horse. After somebody gets title to a horse, after a year, then can they sell the horse? Or
Yeah, once they have the title, it's personal property, and we are
Okay.
totally out of the picture so that they could go ahead and sell the animal. Absolutely.
Do people make a business out of it? This is just an ignorant question on my part. I mean, could you buy a $200 horse and
yeah.
actually, like buying used cars or something?
You could, yeah, we do have some people that adopt these horses. They get them trained, and and then after they're titled, with the idea of selling them, most people tend to keep them because they have such a strong bonding experience with the horse. But I know there's some women that get the pony-sized ones, and they train them for large pony hunter type thing for kids in the East, stuff like that, and they're perfect size for that. So.
Well, that's great.
Yeah.
Something you mentioned earlier, I wanted to go back to. If you come out and you fill an application out at the site, at the auction, how do you guys have time to evaluate it? Do you just eyeball it quickly and say, all right, well, they have a fence or something?
We go through it with the adopter.
Okay.
And sometimes we have lines of people with applications, especially right before the auction. But we will get everybody that's in line. We're going to process them before the auction starts. But we actually go through the application with the adopter. And then, as I said, we do compliance on a lot of animals after the fact within that first year before they're titled. We'll actually go out, check on the animal, see if the adopter needs any advice or anything. So most of them work out great. They really do. Yeah.
Are there a few common pitfalls for the ones that don't? Is it just not spending enough time with them?
Yeah, I think not spending enough time with them is one. Maybe not having the right skills to begin with, not knowing what you're doing. That does happen on occasion. Those are two of the most common. The other problem we sometimes get is people try to go too fast. They've seen a lot of what's called round penning, where you work a horse in a round pen and you it's a gentling method. And sometimes people want to try that and they don't know enough to read the horse to back off when they should. So all they do is teach the horse to run around them.
In circles.
Yeah.
What's the rationale of the round pen? I mean, what does that do? Over time it just gets bored and gentles on its own?
You try to react with the horse's body language and get him to turn to you and face you and start acting like you're the lead horse. That's kind of what it is.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
That's a good question, though. I have so many questions. I mean, is there... Do you guys have a pamphlet or a guidebook or something for horse adopters to answer frequently asked questions?
Yes.
Or do you send them to books that are particularly useful? Because my
several
guess is
different
most of the
books
stuff
out
I
there.
watch on TV, Western
Right.
and so on, are not all that useful. Or
Right.
it's not going to happen like we were talking earlier.
Right.
Kids films like Spirit or Hidalgo probably.
Yeah. Yeah.
They're gentled in 2 minutes. That isn't going to happen.
There are a lot of gentling videos out there, and one thing that's really helped the wild horse is a lot of the natural horsemanship type methods that are currently in vogue work really well with these horses. There are a lot of trainers out there that use them. I could name a bunch, but I probably shouldn't. But anyhow, there's a lot of really good training videos out there. There are several books on what to do when you have an adopted horse. Bring it home, be quiet with it, et cetera, et cetera. So
Great. Jinx,
there are some sources.
We had another question come in, a darn good one, and that's, does whispering work with wild horses? And why don't you first explain what whispering is, besides a Robert Redford film many years ago?
Yeah, and the film was based on a book, too, The Horse
Okay.
Whisperer, and the book is really good. I haven't watched the film. Horse whispering is a term that's used for natural horsemanship or horse gentling. But horse trainers don't like to be called horse whisperers because it's kind of a vogue term. But it's the natural horsemanship, and that does work. That's what I was talking about. It does work really well with wild horses, where you try to work with their body language and your body language and get them to see you as the lead horse. So you're kind of cluing them and moving with them like a lead horse would move them, and you start driving them around, and after a while they'll turn and come into you. So that is the way to train them. That's really one of the best ways to train them.
And where does the whisper come from? You speak softly to them while you're doing this?
Just, you don't really whisper to them. No, it's more body language. It's not whispering like whispering.
Right.
Okay.
So the audience can't hear us. But what about
that's a great question.
Do herds in the wild have a certain set of sounds and noises they use to direct each other, or are they pretty quiet? I actually don't.
Yeah, I think most of the horses are pretty quiet. They do whinny and call, and they've got noises that they make. I moved a bunch of my horses around last night, and they were all whinnying all night long. So in the wild, but they don't make a lot of noise.
So it sounds like
there's like nickers, like a mare will nicker to her foal. They have their own little language, but a lot of the way they interact with each other is body language.
That's what I was going to ask.
Looking directly versus looking to the side.
So a lot of it is your actions as opposed to other senses.
Yeah.
And determine dominance.
Absolutely. And tying back to the horse whispering question, we're predators. You and I are predators. We have our eyes on the front of our faces. Right. Horses are prey. Their eyes are on the sides of their heads. Their reaction when faced with danger is to get out of there. And one thing, if you look directly at them, you are looking at them like a predator will. And so you kind of need to learn to, this is the horse gentling. You kind of don't really look full at them unless you want them to do something. You kind of look to the side and kind of turn a little bit to the side.
I've never heard that before.
Yeah.
That's a great bit of advice.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess that does make it hard. It's like we've just, sold you to a predator.
Yeah.
Go live in their pen.
I know, yeah.
And of course your natural thing is to go out and stare and say, oh, that's a really pretty horse. You really,
yeah. And if you go to our adoption, here you have these corrals of horses with people standing around staring at them. To them, they're like, oh my gosh, we're surrounded by a wolf pack. Yeah.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. So just your body language and the way you react, really, it's really interesting. And all of this natural horsemanship, which is what the prey predator stuff is, and the horse whispering, that's all really become popular in the last 5 to 10 years. So I think it's really been a tremendous benefit to wild horses.
Well, that's great. Jinx, this has been a really fast hour because your subject has been so interesting. And we're just down to our last couple minutes. And I just, before I mentioned the next month's program, I wanted to give you a chance. Is there anything else you want to let folks know about the Wild Horse and Burro program? Any last words of wisdom or appeals?
I guess I would advise them to check our website, except for it's down right now, but it should be up soon.
And I think they can find one off the Department of Interior site that gives a lot of information.
And they can link through there. That's where you get a lot of information. I really would encourage anybody who's considering getting a horse to consider adopting a wild horse. If you don't know if you could take on a full-grown wild horse, think about a yearling or a weanling, because they do gentle up very quickly. And they really are versatile animals. They're hardy and have a lot fewer health problems than domestic horses because it's been survival of the fittest out in the wild. So you're getting a great product at a very low price.
An incredible price.
Yeah.
The dollar store of horse adoptions here.
There you go. We're the largest horse dealer in the world, I think.
Well, Jinx, thank you so much
You're
for
welcome.
coming down to Shepherdstown today. And that was fascinating information about the horses. And I'd like to thank all of you who spent the last hour learning about the Wild Horse and Burro program. Thank you for your time. And I'd like to just let you know that the next in this series on conservationists in action is going to be coming up on June 9th. We're going to have a fisheries biologist and an ethicist named Phil Peaster come out here, who is an expert on desert fishes, which is not an oxymoron. And Phil's going to talk about some really interesting fish restoration they've done with highly endangered desert fish species. He's been working in the field almost 50 years. He's a fascinating character, and I hope you can tune back in June 9th. Thank you.